In the past 2 years, first-time buyers have seen mortgage payments as a share of income rise quite significantly, increasing the cost of buying a house. However, the private renter sector has been even more problematic. In the past 4 years, rents have risen 20%, pushing tenants to spend a higher share of their income on rent. If you're in a position of wondering whether to rent or buy, how does it compare financially? Well, at the moment, the average cost of buying a typical house is in the region of £265,000. If there's a deposit of £20,000, the mortgage will be for £245,000. Assuming a fixed interest rate of 5%, the initial monthly payments would be £1,313, giving a total cost over 30 years of your mortgage of £473,000. Now that is £245,000 capital repayment, but £228,000 of interest payments. But if you're buying a house, there are more upfront costs to consider. This includes solicitor fees, mortgage arrangement costs, survey and search costs, buying white goods and furniture. Stamp duty is possible, though if you're a first-time buyer, you won't pay anything on a house less than £425,000. But you're still looking in the region of perhaps £6,000 upfront costs for getting your house going. Now, the other downside of owning a property is all that maintenance, repairs and insurance. Roofs, guttering, boilers, decorating, it all adds up. Now, this could be in the region of between £1,000 and £2,000 a year. Now, some years you'll spend more, some years you'll spend less. But if we say spend an average of £1,500 a year for 30 years, that's roughly a bill of £45,000 on maintenance over that period. Quite easy, even if it does sound a lot. And don't forget that inflation will increase these maintenance costs over time too. As a very rough rule of thumb, buying a £265,000 house is going to cost you over £500,000 over the next 30 years. But the crucial thing is that after that period is over, the only thing left to pay is the maintenance and insurance costs. You won't have any rent or mortgage payments left. By contrast, how does renting compare? Well, at the moment, the typical average rent in England is £1,327 a month, or £16,000 a year. And it's rather similar to the mortgage cost for an average home. Except with renting, you don't have those upfront costs, the cost of deposit, and all the ongoing maintenance costs that you won't have to pay for. So in the short term at least, renting is marginally cheaper than buying. Though don't forget the housing market is highly regional, and at the moment buying is currently more expensive in London, but cheaper in the North East and Scotland. This probably explains why we've got higher house price inflation in the north than in London and the South East. Of course, if you're renting, you don't have that uncertainty over changing interest rates, which you do when you own a home. If, for example, interest rates were to fall to 4%, the monthly mortgage cost would fall to £1,170. And over 30 years, the total cost would fall to £421,000. But on the other hand, interest rates could go up. If they went up to just 6%, the average monthly cost would be £1,469, and the total mortgage cost suddenly becomes much more, £528,000. However, this is definitely not the end of the story. There are two factors which will heavily tilt the balance against renting in the long term. In the past 19 years, rents in England have risen by 65%. That's 3.4% a year, which is fairly close to the typical inflation rate. Now, if we assume that rents will continue to rise at 3.4% a year, it means that in 10 years' time, your monthly rent will be £1,790 a month. In 20 years' time, it will be £2,500 a month. The really scary thing is that in 50 years' time, you'll be paying £6,800 a month. Now, we would hope that earnings and pensions would keep up with inflation. But this is the big difference between renting and owning. After the end of your mortgage term, mortgage payments, zero. But rent payments keep rising, probably with inflation. Now, after 50 years of paying monthly rent, which rises at about 3.4% a year, you will have paid a total of £2 million to your landlord, which is around 1.5 million more than the cost of buying a home. Now, of course, these figures rest on quite a few assumptions which could change. This is only a rough idea. Perhaps you could end up spending more on maintenance costs or pay for an extension or put solar panels on or something like that. But the big thing is that the longer you live, the bigger the total cost of renting. Now, rent inflation of 3.4% a year is a reasonable assumption. But what about the past 4 years when inflation has been 5% for rents? Now, if rents were to rise by 5% a year for the next 50 years, the total cost of paying rent would increase to 3.3 million. If rents rose 5% a year and you lived another 60 years, the total cost of paying rent in those 60 years would be £5.6 million. Now, that might start to sound silly money, but that is the effect of compounded rent rises, even at a fairly modest 5% a year. Now, I'd like to think that rent growth of 3% a year will be a better guide to future rent inflation than 5%. I certainly hope so. But in the short term at least, there are reasons to be concerned about the private rented sector. The UK population has been rising quite rapidly. Buy-to-let investors are starting to sell. Number of social housing has been squeezed. The rent rises are simple economics, supply and demand. Even if the UK were to build more houses, it's not clear how many would end up in the private rented sector to limit price increases. In the short term, buying a house is expensive. You need a deposit. You need to pay large mortgage payments, and many of all the extra costs associated with buying. But the mortgage payment is then fixed, give or take, changing interest rates. Now, when I bought a house in 2005, my monthly mortgage payments were £950 a month, which was a really high share of my income. And also it was more than the £700 a month I was paying for rent at the time. Now, in those pre-financial crisis days, I could get a self-certification mortgage, which is why I could borrow so much. I had help from my parents for deposit. And also I had a lodger who paid £300 a month, at least some of the time, although not always. But it was really too much because my income wasn't so high in those days. And so I switched to an interest-only mortgage for about 3 or 4 years. But now the monthly mortgage payment is fallen to £450. This is because interest rates are lower and I've been trying to start repay some of the mortgage early. Now, I was definitely lucky in that in 2007 interest rates fell quite dramatically, and this made a mortgage much cheaper in the 2010s. If it had been the late 80s and interest rates had risen to 10% or even higher, it would have been a very different situation and may not even have been able to keep up with mortgage payment. Now, later we'll look at whether there's a chance of those high interest rates coming back. But first, there are definitely other considerations about renting versus buying. Now, renting does have many advantages. It gives flexibility and freedom to move around. Buying a house is a tortuously long process. Repairing a house is not your responsibility or cost. But renting also has many disadvantages. Your landlord might want to sell and then you have to leave, find somewhere else. Repairing a house is not your responsibility, but it means that things may not be repaired properly, and you are to some extent at the mercy of your landlord. There's less sense of ownership, and you can't always make changes to the property that you would like. Renting itself has become a tortuous process with so much competition to get any properties which come on the market. Now, buying a house also has another big advantage that is worth bearing in mind. Since 1980, about 44 years ago, house prices have risen over 1,000%. That's an extra £242,000. Now, a lot of this increase is simply due to inflation. In real terms, house prices have still risen by around 100%. And this is capital gains you don't get when you rent. Now, when you're 80 or whenever, you could sell your house to fund a retirement home. Now, given that house price to income ratios are really stretched and many on the edge of affordability, I think there's definitely a limit to how much real house prices will rise. But if the past is any guide, there will at least be considerable increases in nominal prices just because of the effects of inflation. So that would lead to capital gains you wouldn't get if you were renting. So the thing that could really hurt your decision to buy a house is an unexpected large increase in interest rates. If we go back to our example, interest rates of 8% would increase monthly interest payments to nearly $1,800 and the total cost of a mortgage $650,000. But at least for the foreseeable future, it's really hard to see that kind of interest rate. If anything, interest rates are going to go down and settle around 4% for the foreseeable future, which sometimes is quite a short time. But anyway, that's another story. But don't forget, the long-run trend has been for falling interest rates. Another thing worth bearing in mind is that the mortgage costs can actually be reduced if you're in a position to repay early. As I say, when I got a mortgage in 2005, I had interest only for a few years, and I took out the longest possible term, 43 years. But over the years, as it got slightly more affordable, smaller share of income, I've been trying to overpay the mortgage and pay it off early. So rather than invest in a pension or savings, I use any surplus income to pay off the mortgage. And this hopefully will reduce the overall cost of the mortgage and cost of buying a house. So I think that this is the big picture. The first few years of buying a house are always very hard because you have high mortgage payments, you have all the upfront costs of moving, and you have the uncertainty about what may happen to interest rates. But over time, if there's inflation, if wages continue to rise, then it does become a smaller share of your income. But renting is very different because rents tend to rise at least with inflation. And so you've always got that problem that your monthly rent payments will be rising. And if you live there a long, long time, then it does start to multiply rather worryingly. I think the only way that renting would become a better deal than buying would be as if somehow we had very low rent inflation, less than 1% a year. And in that case, renting would certainly be a lot more attractive. But at least at the moment, it's hard to see a situation where rents become stagnant. In fact, many private landlords are threatening to sell. And this video goes into the question of whether it matters, how will it affect the private rented sector. So do check out that video. Cheers.